Welcome to the Wayne Public Library's virtual author chat. My guest today is Carol Benton Hende. Carol is an award-winning author who pens stories of resilience and hope. Her novels, Orchid Blooming and Goodbye Orchid, are inspired by wounded veterans and have won 20-plus literary awards, including the 2020 American Fiction Award for Urban Fiction and the Pinnacle Achievement Award for Multicultural Fiction. Her book has also been featured in Glamour, BuzzFeed, Parade, Travel and Leisure, Chicago Tribune, LA Times, among others. Carol is a speaker, strategist, board member, and climate reality leader. She credits her good fortune to her humorous husband and teenage twins who prove that love really does conquer all. Welcome, Carol. Please tell us a little more about yourself and your new novel.
It's great to be here, Janette. Thanks so much for that warm welcome and that lovely intro. So I think the bio covered so much of me, that by day I work as a strategist, and then I'm also a mom of twins, and then this author life that brings me here today is such an important part of my, what I do and my identity. It really has come full circle because I've grown up with a love of literature. And so it is wonderful to be able to say now that I'm a multi-published author, and also I speak at writers and publishing conferences and really love it. And what I love is that feeling of connection between the writing and readers. And when I get that feedback from readers and hear the ways in which the work touches them, that is the best feeling in the world.
Can you tell us a little more about your most recent novel, Orchid Blooming, and also a little about the previous one about Goodbye Orchid? I believe they're a series, so they are tied together somehow.
And they absolutely are a series. And so let me introduce you to 27-year-old Orchid Page. She is an executive in the beauty industry. And although she is incredibly hardworking and successful, a lot of what's marked her life is tragedy she had suffered as a child. So she had witnessed the death of her parents, which of course is going to shape the course of her life and is going to color how she sees things. And she carries that tragedy into adulthood. So now, what she wants more than anything is to win a work trip to go to China to be able to feel closer to her mother's memory. Orchid is half Asian, half Caucasian, and her mother is from China. And so she wants this more than anything. But competition is super fierce. She has coworkers who are really qualified. She needs to learn Chinese, and her boss has told her she needs more advertising experience. So she starts to seek that. She has a huge amount of agency. She's a very determined person, fierce and hardworking. So she meets the head of an ad agency and she convinces him to mentor her, and he offers her pro bono work on a campaign to get the advertising experience she needs. However, there's going to be obstacles as as there always are. The work itself with injured military veterans actually triggers her unresolved PTSD. And so she has to decide whether she can overcome her vulnerabilities to be able to do the work that she knows is going to unlock this opportunity that she wants more than anything. And then, oh, by the way, there just so happens to be chemistry, undeniable, crazy chemistry with this person that's supposed to be her mentor, supposed to be a professional relationship that she's promised herself she's going to keep at arm's length and have it all be business, all business. So you can imagine the antics that will ensue.
You mentioned the wounded veterans. How did they inspire your story, influence the message of the novel, which is, getting back to good for Goodbye Orchid?
Yes. So in fact, and thanks for asking that so that we can talk a little bit about the second novel, Goodbye Orchids. The second novel chronologically in the storyline, even though it was published earlier. And so, yes, seeing stories in the news about combat wounded veterans is really what inspired me to start writing this entire series. And although the characters are not military characters, the journey of their character arcs mirrors that of combat wounded veterans. So in Goodbye Orchid, what happens is that Phoenix Walker, this head of an ad agency, we meet him when he starts at the top of his game, like combat wounded veterans would. They are trained, they are ready physically, mentally, they're at the top of their games. But when they're wounded, they fall so far. And this is what happens in Goodbye Orchid. Phoenix Walker suffers an accident that changes him forever. And as a result, when he wakes in the hospital and he sees what's happened, he's actually thinking about Orchid Page, whom we met in Orchid Blooming. And he's longing for her. He wants to reach out to her. But he also remembers that tragedy that we talked about, the trauma that she's carried into adulthood. He knows that she's sensitive to images of trauma. And therefore, when he looks down his hospital bed and sees what's happened to himself, he realizes he's become that very image of trauma that will trigger her. And he feels he's faced with the hardest decision of his life. Whether to love Orchid, he needs to leave her without explaining why. People say hashtag bring tissues. It's a very emotional story. And some reviewers have likened it to a modern day Affair to Remember, if anyone out there remembers that movie or that story, which is, again, very heart-wrenching and emotional.
Okay. Okay. And I should ask, is there going to be a third part to the series? Since it seems like you're going to leave this kind of in a cliffhanger moment with actually the first book, but in the order, in the sequence, it's actually the second. Is there a third?
There is a third, and I will say each of the books can be read as standalone, and they each have an emotionally satisfying ending. So there are no cliffhangers at the end of the book. Sometimes some books are left with a cliffhanger where you have to read the next one to find out what happens. Each of these is a whole story, very complete, can be read as a standalone, but they also all connect with each other. And so, yes, there's a third one. And the reason that this one initial book of Goodbye Orchid has now become what's going to be a trilogy is because of readers. Meeting with book clubs and people in libraries and bookstores who have read Goodbye Orchid, I heard again and again from readers that they wanted more. They wanted to know what happens before the first page of Goodbye Orchid. How did Orchid and Phoenix meet? What happened between them? And then at the end of Goodbye Orchid, they also want to know what happens after that last page. And so that's how the one book ended up becoming a trilogy. And so I'm really excited for Always Orchid to come out in 2023 and really bring that full story to bear that people have been asking for.
Okay. And Always Orchid, is that something that you're currently working on, or is it completed? Uh, what's the status of the third?
The manuscript is written and it's in the editing process.
Okay. Okay. And of in all three, I assume there's some recurring characters. Is there any character that is your favorite character of the books?
You know what? As an author, you fall in love with all your characters. You get to know them so well, and there are some amazing characters. Maybe I'll come back and touch on Phoenix and Orchid in a moment because, of course, they are so primary to the story. But I will mention that readers have really also loved Caleb, who is Phoenix's twin brother, Veronica, who is Caleb and Phoenix's mother. And of course, they have friends and coworkers, and each of them plays a role and has, unique personality traits to them. But I think what's so interesting about both Phoenix and Orchid, who are the main characters, and why I love them so much, and actually, I should probably tell you a little bit of the story of why they're named the way they are and how their names are actually really meaningful. And so for me, Orchid is really special because although she has suffered this tragedy as a child and her life has been marked by it, she still strives, she still challenges herself, she strives to be the best person she can. And that's why the name Orchid is really meaningful because orchids have a reputation for being delicate, which is part of why Phoenix feels he's faced with that hard decision of whether to love her, he needs to leave her, because he's worried about her fragility from that childhood trauma. However, when you talk to orchidologists, people who study orchids, in the wild, orchids are actually quite resilient and hardy, which I love this name for orchid because although she may have a reputation for being delicate, she ends up having incredible agency and resiliency and strength. And I'll just briefly touch on Phoenix as well, because he is an incredible character modeled on these combat wounded veterans, falling from being at the top of his game to this life changing accident. And his name, of course, is probably a bit more evident why it is Phoenix, based on mythology, in which, Phoenix is a god that burns and then must rise from ashes to rebirth and find new life, which is what Phoenix needs to go through after his accident.
Okay. And as you mentioned, real life people that you've met, are any of the characters based on individuals that you've met, or are they just like amalgamation of all, certain people that you've met? Um, how
Yeah.
much came through in at least one of the characters or any of the characters?
Yeah, none of these characters are an actual, individual that I know personally that is just a copycat of a real life person. Of course, they're all, amalgamations. But I'll say two things. I'll say first, I think that although the exact backstory and what happens, the plot line, that is not pulled from anyone's real life, that the emotions have a huge amount of authenticity to them, that they are universally felt. And this is why readers have a connection with the story, with the characters, and really feel what they go through because the emotions are really authentic. Um, and then, secondly, what I'll say is that real life people have seen that their experiences are reflected on the pages of Orchid Blooming and Goodbye Orchid. And it especially touches me when people who've been through challenges, medical trauma, or wounded veterans say that they see themselves in these characters, even though they weren't meant to, it wasn't mirroring somebody specific. And I'll give you one example. One of the veterans who helped me is Doc Jacobs. Doc Jacobs is a Purple Heart decorated, Bronze Star of Valor decorated combat wounded veteran, and he says that the story and reading the journey of this couple reminded, and especially Phoenix's accident, reminded him of the 11 months he spent at Walter Reed after he had been blown up by an IED or improvised explosive device in Iraq. And what really is incredible to me is he says, in addition to just reminding him of his own experience, it actually deepened his understanding of what his family must have been through because he had always seen that experience from his own perspective, from his own eyes. But Goodbye Orchid and Orchid Blooming are written in multiple perspectives. And so you hear from the perspective of um, the twin brother Caleb, from Veronica, their mother. And from hearing all these different perspectives, he said to me for the first time, he really thought about what that must have been like that time at Walter Reed for his dad and his grandma, or he calls her his Gma. Those 11 months they spent by his bedside were grueling and difficult and emotional for them as well. And he had this new insight because of reading, especially reading Goodbye Orchid.
And what was the research like for you? How did you go about doing the research to get into those characters and get that essence of how they felt?
The research was so incredibly important because these stories are inspired by combat wounded veterans and shining a light on disability awareness, shining a light on PTSD, and shining hope for those for people who might be going through those challenges. The research was so important, and it really took multiple phases. First, I took it seriously because I wanted to honor the experience that people have been through. And so I researched everything I could in terms of what exists. And there is a lot out there. There are books, there are articles, there are videos, there's so much material. And I really did immerse to try to understand as much as I could. But your question is really astute because you're asking about getting the emotional details right as well. And so some of the information, really, it was a little hard to discern entirely from desk research. And so the first hand research was actually really important too, primary research.
Mhm.
Being able to speak with medical professionals, surgeons, social workers, psychologists, and also with combat wounded veterans who helped me shape the story, ensure that the details were right, and actually acted as incredible sensitivity readers after the manuscript was done to be able to help me tweak the details. And I really thank them. You can see their names in my acknowledgments for both books.
And when you say research, one of the things, people who do historical or a topic such as this, how long do you take to do the research? Like, is it months of research, or is it, are you starting to write and then you find that you need to like go out and talk to more people, or actually, go online and look, maybe forums or groups or something to get more of a sense of the mental, like the headspace of these characters?
Yeah, I think it's a bit organic as you're describing, which is as, of course, there's some upfront research. And yes, this is, in terms of duration, it is definitely months long. It is not a short process. And then there is research along the way because as an author, as I'm imagining what scenarios must be like, what they might feel like, what the emotions would be, or what actually happens medically. Also, that was another important part. Questions would arise, and then I would either look for sources that might be able to answer it, reputable sources, or be able to go to this bevy of people who had been so generous with their time to help and make sure that these things were correct.
Is this Were these your first books, or have you published anything in the past? Um,
These were my first novels. I've
your
probably
first-
been writing since I was a kid, but more like stories and journaling. These were the first novels I've written.
okay. And what made you like finally like sit down and say, okay, I'm going to write this novel, not just a short story? What what propelled you? What was the catalyst?
It's so interesting because I didn't know that I was writing a novel when I first started writing. I was simply going through what was a hard time with one of our boys. We have twins, and finding that writing was a wonderful place of solace. And I would definitely recommend this for anyone, writing just for yourself. And that's initially what I thought I was doing. I thought I was writing for myself. I'd been inspired by stories of combat wounded veterans I'd seen in the news. And I was pouring my heart out onto the page for me. Honestly, I didn't know I was writing a novel at first. And then I thought as I was writing, the story became so meaningful to me that I thought I would just improve my craft a bit by joining a writing community. So I found a local writing group called Women Who Write, and they meet in person. They have these in-person critique groups, and the one that I joined would meet every other week. And every other Saturday, we would sit at Mary Lee Waldron's kitchen table in Bernardsville, New Jersey, and we would read our work aloud to each other in order to get feedback and critique each other's work. I learned a lot from that experience because getting the live feedback right in the moment is an incredible feeling. And this is the day I remember so crystal clear, the day I realized that this was not just writing for myself, was when I read the scene in which Phoenix wakes in the hospital, finds what happened to himself after the accident, and was able to move this group of writers to tears. And I realized the emotional impact was not just for me, it wasn't just my own emotional impact, that I was able to move, and that the story, the authenticity of the story was able to move other people. And that's what planted the seed of an idea that perhaps I wasn't just writing for me and that perhaps I should pursue publication. And now, 2 books later.
Yes. Um, you've mentioned, you have I mentioned in your bio that you do have a career. Um, how does writing fit into your daily life? Do you have a writing routine?
So it is a little hard to fit it in, I do have to say, because I do have a full-time job and it's a significant one and a career that I love. I love my company, a very purpose-driven, values-based company. I am responsible for governing our digital transformation for the organization, as well as looking after digital for sustainability. So there's, really significant responsibility there that I take very seriously and takes a lot of my time. And so my free time, which is at night and on the weekends, is what I spend on speaking and writing. But when we say writing, the thing is that, and writers don't always know this when they first come to writing, but that part of a writer's career and a part of a writer's what they have to do is not only the sitting at the keyboard, not only plotting, but also such a large part of the time is outreach, is letting readers know that these amazing stories exist, and encouraging readers to check out the work through interviews, through interacting with people on social media. Through just this last weekend, I was at a bookstore to do a book signing and an author talk, and all of that. It is tremendous and it is so fun, and I'm so happy I get to do it. It also does take time, and therefore that is time, away from the writing. So there is time for writing, but then there's a lot of other things as well.
And is there a difficult part to writing for you? Like, would you say the editing or the actual just getting time to write?
I mean, both of those are very true. And right now, I am having a hard time getting time to write and I need to be working on edits for book 3, but it has been a little challenging with everything going on. It sounds like I'm sure it's a theme you've heard from many authors, and I know I have heard from many authors. I speak at writers conferences, so I meet a lot of authors that way. In a few weeks, I'll be at Novelists Inc. at St. Pete's Beach, Florida, and I'm sure that's going to be a theme is how do we juggle it all?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's not easy from everything you guys are saying. It's a recurring theme, yes. Um, you mentioned bringing your readers to tears, getting a lot of feedback. What was your most memorable reader encounter?
Oh dear. There are such wonderful ones. I mean, there are readers that come find me at book festivals and say, I read your book and I loved it. Would you sign this for me? And which is amazing. Readers who've driven hours to meet me at a bookstore to be able to meet in person. And then also the middle of the night emails. I get notes from readers saying, you kept me up way past my bedtime because I had to find out what happened and I couldn't put the book down until I got to the very end. I've had readers tell me they've read the story in one fell swoop, like one sitting. And these aren't novellas. So this is real dedication. And so people tell me they're quite page turners. So all of these are just lovely experiences. Or people tell me that it um it just gives them comfort to feel like their experiences are reflected on the page, that they feel very seen. These are very magical, yeah, incredibly magical moments.
And do you read reviews?
So I do, and I know that some writers don't, and I totally respect that decision because I think that what I hear from writers who don't want to read the reviews is that a negative one can get stuck in their head. So for me, I do read them because I think so. Two things I would say. One, I think there's some learning to be had in terms of what do people react to? What do they notice? How do they characterize the work? It's like a little bit of a focus group. And I think that that piece of information can be valuable. Also, though, the second thing I would add, and what I've learned now that I've had a book out, is that really part of a reader's reaction to your work has to do with what they bring to the story. Part of what they might react to, whether it be a positive or negative reaction, could be something that happened in their own lives that's either, triggering a memory or, and so I think that that helps me not take it so personally. And the way I've come to this realization is really that even within a book club, let's say, where you'd have 10 different people reading the same work, but experience of it, their reaction to it, what pieces they focus on are different. And so I can only attribute that to, it's what that person's bringing. And so I can't take full responsibility. If somebody doesn't like something, that's totally their right. And I think it has to do with the individual nature of each of us. And
Mhm.
so then I don't let it, you know, get inside my head the way that I hear some writers say that that's the reason they don't read the reviews.
Okay. Um, so I'm going to switch gears a little and talk a little bit about your publishing journey. Um, how did you go about getting your books published? As you said, you started out and it was for you, and then you kind of grew into novella. Well, you had a whole manuscript. What did you do? Where did
Yeah.
you shop it around?
Yeah. I mean, there were a few key steps, and I would say the ones, because I know there might be aspiring writers who are going to listen in on this conversation later. And so I think for me, a few of the critical milestones were one, attending writers' conferences and therefore building my network of agents, editors, other writers. And it was actually at one of these writers' conferences where at Writers Digest, where I've spoken, they have something called Pitch Slam. At Pitch Slam, you get 90 seconds to pitch yourself to an agent or editor. You get 90 seconds of feedback, and then that's it. After that short encounter, that 3-minute encounter, the other person decides do they want to request a partial or full manuscript, and then you move on. And so it was at Pitch Slam actually is how I met my agent. And so that was a very critical milestone, being able to secure an agent. And also, that gives a new author, an aspiring author, a new writer, such confidence to see that others believe in the work, and then you build your own confidence over time too. Um, Another key milestone was finding the right publishing partner. So, Goodbye Orchid was published traditionally by Kohler Books. And that was a good experience because they're not such a big publisher, that they were willing and able to collaborate with me, and also to recognize the marketing expertise I bring from having been in brands for a large part of my career, and being willing to listen to that, which I know from speaking with other authors isn't always the case. So I'm very grateful for that. And now this latest phase of my publication journey is realizing that publishing through another company means I didn't get to see all of the production pieces, and I thought there was more for me to learn. So that for these next two books, I've created an imprint called a zine press, and am learning a lot of that, which there is a lot to learn when it comes to publishing, as I'm sure you know.
Wow, congratulations. I mean, that's impressive to have
Thank
your own.
you.
Um, you mentioned getting an agent through the publishing slam. How much of the book was ready? Was the whole novel written, or at what stage was your first book?
So there was a first draft of a manuscript, but from that point on, and I'm sure that writers who've been through this process will, be able to relate to this. There were many changes. The agent had a point of view on what needed to be changed. The editor had a point of view of what needed to be changed. The publisher did. And I think what was lovely in my experience anyway was that there was a lot of respect for my point of view, so I don't feel like anything was shoved down my throat. I felt like it was quite collaborative.
That's good. That's good. That's really good. So, getting with a traditional publisher, because sometimes it's not always the case. I've heard. Um, one of the things that I always mentioned, that there's a graphic at the bottom. I believe it's Goodbye Orchid. Sorry. For instance, the orchid on the bottom of the page shatters as the characters go through the low points in the novel, and then I guess come back. Um, was that Did you inspire that? Did you talk to them about that, or was that their creative idea?
So that came from me, and I'll tell you the origin story of where that came from. It is really beautiful. This design detail is in both Orchid Blooming and Goodbye Orchid. So the cover of Orchid Blooming has orchids, blossoming, petals blossoming on the cover. The cover of Goodbye Orchid has orchids shattering because of the physical and emotional shattering of the characters. And that's replicated on the bottom right corner of every page. If you were to flip through the book and look there, the orchids will appear to blossom or to shatter until you get to the deaths of the story. And then they visually come together for the emotionally satisfying ending. The place that idea came from is actually my sister-in-law. So my sister-in-law, before Goodbye Orchid was published, and while I was working on cover design in collaboration with Kohler Books, said to me she had read a book where it was about octopi, and that when you flipped through the pages, the 8 legs of the octopi would move. And instantly, when she said that, the idea was so clear in my head that we needed to have the orchids shattering and then blossoming. And then the designer I worked with, Kelly Emery, was really lovely and bringing that to life.
That is a very creative point, and that's beautiful. Like, especially going with the tone of what is happening, the themes throughout the book. So that's pretty special. I have to say, when I read that, I was like, that is really cool.
I have to say,
Unfortunately, the
reader.
book wasn't here. I couldn't see it.
Oh, yeah. There's a video of me flipping through it on my YouTube channel, so anyone can go
Okay.
take a look there. And I do have to say, readers who buy the ebook sometimes then also want to own the paperback or hardcover, because that's the only way you can get the flipping feature is through the physical book. You won't, even though you can see the detail in the ebook, you won't be able to see the motion.
So I'm going to ask, I know you mentioned writers groups. Are you a member of more than one, several writers groups? How important were they? Obviously, critique partners were extremely important early on. But writers groups, are you still members? Of course, New Jersey Romance Writers is how we connected. So yes to that one, but any others?
Yes, so I'm also part of Poets and Writers, and I'm a member of Women Fictions Writers Association, WFWA. And, it turns out, although I probably thought my work initially was romance because there was such a core love story in the books, that my work probably leans more towards women's fiction or contemporary fiction because there are these other incredibly rich themes beyond just the love story, the character growth of Orchid Page, for instance, the themes of forgiveness and heritage and love and loss. Like there's just, I think that I've had readers say to me when they expect romance and they come to the pages, they get enough of the love, but then there's also so much else that it probably transcends to beyond that. And that's when I started to find other writers groups. But NJRW had been such a lovely home, and I really appreciate the authors there and really am happy to be part of a warm, welcoming community.
That's good to know. That's good to know. And if, what advice would you give a new writer that's just starting out?
Yeah, I'd say 2 things. One, perseverance will definitely help because there's going to be rejection. It is a lot of work. And so perseverance is going to help. And then the second thing is linked to that because in order to keep persevering when things are difficult, I find personally that it's very helpful to understand my inspiring purpose or my why. What's the reason I do what I do beyond the obvious profit or functional purposes? And for me, when I ask myself that question, and I actually did this as an exercise, really sat down and thought about that before publishing Goodbye Orchid. And for me, the answer came back that I aim to inspire hope and empathy for people and planet. Through the writing, through my speaking, through my day job, through the boards of trustees I serve on, through being a climate reality leader, etc. And it's helpful to know that because in hard times, you can remind yourself, why am I doing what I do? And actually, the clarity of my why gives me more energy to do those things that are important to me.
Okay. At this point, I say if there's any questions, if you would write it into the chat. I will then read it to Carol. Um, and while anyone types, then I will ask you what I call the fun question. which is an online reviewer mentioned that each chapter heading in your book is the title of a Jack White song. Do you listen to music while you write? If so, what do you listen to?
It's such a great question, and I love that people notice that. And so the Jack White titles are in Goodbye Orchid. Every chapter, and also the epigraph has a Jack White, a little snippet of a lyric, and it also plays into a little part of the story. And I did, so for Goodbye Orchid, while I was writing that, I listened to a lot of Jack White, and not just Jack White on his own or White Stripes, the band that he's so famous for, but even maybe some of the lesser known bands like Raconteurs. And so I listened to so much Jack White that it just made sense to me that it play a role in the book, and as a way to pay homage to his music, the way his music was able to move me. Now, for Orchid Blooming, it is such a deeply felt, deeply emotional story. So I found that although sometimes I did like having music while I was writing, I needed music that didn't have lyrics because the lyrics would then distract me. And so it was music without lyrics is what I listened to during Orchid Blooming.
So I'm going to assume that the title headings or the chapter headings are not, are not Jack White, or
Correct.
they're
That's
not
right.
any here. Um,
That's right.
okay, that's
Yeah.
great.
Although the chapter headings in Orchid Blooming, I try to stay with that because his song titles are almost like a little poem in and of themselves. Like it tells a little story in such a few words. And so I try to stay with that voice for the chapter titles in Orchid Blooming. So I think that the chapter titles will feel familiar because of that. It has a theme to it, even though they're not explicitly Jack White song titles.
Okay. Well, I have to say, I did not get any questions. So I'm going to say thank you to Carol for coming tonight and for joining us and for telling us a little more about Orchid Blooming and Goodbye Orchid. And is it Orchid, the third one that you're working on? Always Orchid. Um, so we can have that look forward to next year in 2023. But thank you again for joining us this evening. It was a pleasure talking to you, and thank you for participating. Um, so again, thanks.
Yeah, no, lovely. So great to chat with you. And in case anybody's looking for me out there, I'm findable on social media, and you can find me via my website. You can see my name underneath my picture there. But one easy place to find me is my link tree. So anyone who wants to go online and go to linktr.ee/CVDH, that link tree will lead you to a place where you can sign up for my newsletter, connect with me on social media, find places to buy Orchid Blooming and Goodbye Orchid, whether it be through bookshop.org, which would support indie bookstores, Amazon, etc. It's pretty much available wherever books are sold.